So after a few days in Manus County, sorry my pronunciation, Xinjiang, region. So what's the impression of the wines you've been tasted in the last few days?
It's really interesting, first of all, because for a lot of us it's the first time to have an experience of tasting this many wines from a region we're not all too familiar with. And honestly, it's been a mixed bag. There's been highs, there's been lows, there's been faults, there's been issues of one kind, and things got absolutely perfect the other. So it's interesting to see stylistic diversity. It's interesting to see the range of styles coming out, the range of winemaking techniques, just from every level, really, from not so well executed to some absolutely exquisite examples.
What do you think?
Yeah, I really agree. I think it was a mixed bag. There were some real highlights, especially I think the Cabernets and the Cabernet blends, and there was some real superstars in there. But also some of the wines really showed their provenance in terms of very high alcohol and maybe really strong tannin or really strong oak. And I think we were looking for a balance in the wines.
I think you asked for our impression. My first impression is that it's a very red, sort of heavy, dominant wine region, and production is quite heavily slanted towards red wines. And also grape varieties, at least the ones we have tasted, seems to be to a large extent limited to one variety supported with a few others. But we have tasted of that particular variety, which is the Cabernet. We have tasted some very good examples, some perhaps less good ones. There were some very top end, some very good ones. I think the middle range was kind of lacking. It was either very top end or very low end. That was my impression.
I think as well, I would feel that we're in Xinjiang, and a lot of the wines were from, not all of them, but a lot of wines are from Xinjiang, and we're right over in the west. It's probably less developed in a winemaking sense than the areas around the east, where maybe Shandong, and certainly then moving inland a bit to Ninja. I'm sure I'm pronouncing this completely wrong. I'm sure it's not Ninja, but I think it almost feels like they're a little step behind. I think we've talked about this a bit, but the fact that if you think about Australia a few years ago, it was all about oak and big wines and heavy bottles, and then they moved slowly away from it. Then we talked Argentina, similar, and I almost feel certainly in this part of China, it's still about a lot of Cabernet, a lot of oak, a lot of heavy bottles if you're at the top end of the range, and they probably they're on a journey, and they haven't got to the point that other countries have got to.
That's a very good point. And talking about Cabernet, because you've mentioned a few times, and very dominant here in the tasting, I think they represented more than 50% of the wines you tasted were Cabernet. So let's talk about Cabernet and Cabernet blend. So how do you think the wine performs? So Isa, do you want to start?
We have had some very good examples. I think for a lot of the Cabernet and Cabernet blend wines, my impression was that there was a lot of winemaking going on, and I felt some of the wines could have been perhaps harvested a bit earlier, for example, to retain more freshness in the wine. So I have the sense that the vineyard technology is lagging behind the technology in the winery. So I think the vineyard work and vineyard knowledge needs to catch up with the knowledge in the cellar for these wines to go up in a notch or two in terms of quality and style.
That's good point. And what's your view, Will?
Yeah, again, I kind of agree with Isa's first point earlier. It's a little polar, and there's good top and good bottom. That kind of middle was a little wavy, I suppose. But again, we did find a lot of issues similarly, probably in the vineyards, as you mentioned as well, but also alcohol concerns being quite high was quite a consistent thing we found as well, and not always well integrated. But what was positive was a lot of very clear and distinct Cabernet fruit was on show. It was almost very well put together that it's clearly Cabernet. It's clearly playing to its strengths. There's just tweaking issues either in the vineyard or either technically just to kind of get things as they should be.
And Dror, what do you think?
Yeah, I think first of all the best examples that we tasted were world class, and I think the winemakers should be really proud. I think the wines that scored higher were wines that showed, one, still a lot of fruit character, and the wines that we found didn't score very well, had more extraction and more oak, and the alcohol was a lot noticeable. So the wines, because they're naturally high in alcohol, they need a lot of fruit character to provide that balance. And then they need to be mindful of the level of tannin and making sure that the wines are in balance. And we did find that with some of the wines.
Nice. Any comment on the Cabernet?
No, I mean, I think the Cabernet seems to be slightly different from different regions and maybe from different producers as well. And there's a lot of us, we've all talked a lot of big alcohol, there's a lot of oak. I think as long as you've still got that Cabernet character, and we did get that Cabernet character a lot, and then you've got balance, it works. I mean, for me, I seem to have found a couple of wines or a few wines from Shandong Penglai particularly that were a little bit lighter and a little bit more old world Cabernet in style, and I thought they were really nice. But I think it depends where you are and who's making it.
Yeah. And well, we've only been here for a couple of days, but we already heard about Marcelin. It's a name, the grape variety that a few producers are mentioning, and it seems to have found its new home in China. So obviously we had a small representation here, but it would be great to hear your view on what you think of the Marcelin potential in China. So where do you want to start?
I think for the most part I've been very impressed. We had 2 flights of Marcelin over the couple of days. One of them was very strong, one of them was a little more hit and miss, but to be expected. But it's really exciting to see it developing into its own nice kind of Grenache characters, nice bright red fruit characters, but it's really, like you say, it's finding a home, and a lot of winemakers seem to know what they're doing with it. We had a gold medal Marcelin, we had plenty of silver medal Marcelins, we didn't have to kick many Marcelins out. So I think it's a turning point almost. I think this time next year when it comes to Marcelin, the standard will keep getting up as winemakers get a bit more experience with it.
That's exciting. Isa, what do you think?
With Marcelin, I am still undecided, not just about Marcelin here in this country, but around the world as well. It seems like winemakers and the viticulturists love to grow and make wine from it. But there seems to be a disconnect between those people and the end consumer. And I think if the demand in the market rises for Marcelin, then yes, of course. But making the wine is one thing, to create the demand for it is another thing. I think that will be a challenge for anyone making wine from Marcelin. I do believe it has got qualities to achieve status of high quality wine. It's just that I fear sometimes the demand out there for it is going to have to be created, and it might take longer than people would like.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jan. And what do you think? What's your view on the tasting?
Yeah, I think after tasting, I think it provides a really good counterpoint to Cabernet Sauvignon because of the dominance of Cabernet Sauvignon in the market. Marcelin is a lot lower in tannin, a lot sweeter in fruit, a bit like Grenache, like Will said. And I think that the best examples that we saw had that floral strawberry character that I think customers would like. So I think done well, it can provide a good point of difference.
Susie?
Yeah, I mean, I think we did have a few Marcelins actually, and I had quite high expectations because, coming to China, it's been described as their sort of potential new USP, and you kind of want it to be great. I don't know that we found it was great right now, but I think it has got a lot of, where else makes a lot of Marcelin? So, it's a great variety up for grabs, which is great. And I think that, the potential style of it, the Grenache element, but then with a little bit of freshness as well, could work really well here. And, we got a gold, we didn't get any more than that. But I think it's worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's pretty good to hear, to have that signature grape potentially. And what about the whites? So they're obviously a very small percentage, very, as you say, very red dominated tasting, but I think they're represented about 15%. So what do you think of the white? Any highlight from the whites? Who wants to start, Isa?
I actually thought the quality of the white wines were quite high, and I was surprised for it to be only about 15% of the total production. And I think, looking at the country's cuisine, I know there are many different types of it in the country, cuisine-wise. There is a bigger space for white wines in general. the preference of the local consumer might be more slanted towards red, but I think that will change. And the white wines we have tasted, from Chardonnay to Petit Manseng and few other varieties, have been actually very pleasant, and I've enjoyed them. So I probably would like to see a bit more white wine produced there.
That's interesting. What do you think, Dror?
So in our panel we tasted all Chardonnay, so it was just Chardonnay, and I thought they were well made but mid-level. There weren't any kind of big stars in there. I think we'd like to see more in the future, but the Chardonnays were, I think, acceptable.
Really?
That's interesting. We only had Chardonnay as well, but I think ours were a little bit more polarising. I completely agree with Isa's point. Only 15% is very surprising. I would have thought, especially considering the quality of some we found, there's definitely potential. Usually we found it to be consistently good fruit-wise for the Chardonnay, just often a little overworked in the winery afterwards, where we found some more technical issues, particularly with oaking, particularly with alcohol, particularly with acidity as well, was a question, and quite a few that weren't as brighter examples. But we did have one or two which were exceptional and would hold up anywhere in the world in a tasting. So it's definitely one of those places, one of those grapes with potential. But I want to see more white wines and more diversity, I think, as well, because just Chardonnay need a bit more, I think, to keep it interesting.
Yeah. And 2 golds in white
Yeah,
wine.
I know we did have 2 golds in white wine, and we didn't, as everybody said, we didn't have that many white wines. It would have been nice to see more, it really would, but I think it's representative of what's being made at the moment. I do wonder, maybe, as I said, everything's a little bit behind. I think whites will come to the fore a little bit more. I think the great varieties that people talk about are Petit Manseng and Chardonnay, and we had a Petit Manseng Gold, which was great, but would have been great to have tasted more. And the Chardonnays, I thought, yeah, they were pretty good. Or they showed a potential. I don't know where they're going to go with Chardonnay, but there was potential, definitely. Also, there's a lot of Riesling kicking about, but we didn't really see much of that, and that would have been interesting to have tasted more. Do you know what else I'd like to see? Some rosé. We really didn't see any rosé.
Very good
And
point.
only one sparkling as well.
We had one.
Yeah, where's the rosé?
That's
I
a
would
very
love
good
to see
point.
that.
I guess in China they're more red wine drinkers than white, so I
But
guess
you sort of think with their cuisine and
Totally, I do see
rosé would
definitely
be
opportunity
lovely,
there,
wouldn't
isn't
it?
there?
yeah,
But
definitely.
also, look at the weather outside.
Yes.
What would you like to drink?
Yeah,
A nice fresh rosé.
Yeah.
cold
Perfect.
rosé.
Perfect.
Let's move on to now the Chinese consumer. So we all know that it's well known that Chinese consumers have a different palate to, let's say, the UK consumers, that they tend to favor more of dry red over acidity. So I think it would be really helpful if you could share what you think are the trends in UK for the producers, so they get a better understanding of what's working in UK. They were during our visit, they were fluorescent to see the bottle weight, but the style of wine that are really trending in UK. So who wants to maybe ease up for the entrees, since you are running this restaurant?
I think in our restaurant, we do get many guests from China, and the ones at least we get, they invariably prefer wines with more Pinot-esque style, lighter style. They invariably drink, when they drink white, like white Burgundy or wines modeled on that. But if you look at the overall sort of consumption of wines, I think, generally speaking, red wines with higher acidity, slightly lower alcohol, tannic or not tannic, depends on the variety, are preferred. With the whites, there is a wider sort of thing. Again, dry Rieslings do quite well. Certain sort of styles of Sauvignon does well. The skin contact wines always do well, and there seems to be a particular market now in UK. As a restaurant, if I ignore wines made with skin contact or low intervention, you are actually excluding quite a large segment of the market from your restaurant. So I think that's a definite sort of, it's not even a trend anymore, it's an established demand that is there, and it seems to be spreading across the world. I see it more and more wherever I go, those style of wine. So I think definitely the skin contact orange wine, that style is there to stay. and it's divisive at sometimes, but that's not a bad thing. It creates conversation.
Yeah. And what about you, Dror, who's working, representing one of the leading supermarkets, Marks Spencer?
Yeah. So I think first of all, in the off-trade, the market is more geared towards white wine than it is red wine. So I think that already creates a big difference. And actually, at the moment, white is outperforming red wine, so growing market share. So I think that does present a bit of a challenge. The other trend is for lighter or more elegantly balanced styles and lower alcohols, and I think part of that's driven by customer preference, and also part of it's driven by the duty system in the UK, which penalises higher alcohol wines. So I think the wines that we tasted that were slightly more suitable had either slightly lower alcohol or the alcohol was more in balance, and things like Pinot Noir and Sanso and things that have lighter body do form a trend in the UK. And then I do want to touch on your point about bottle weights, because that's a massive thing. Sustainability and being able to tell the sustainability story to customers is a big thing for M&S, and I think in the UK in general. And the general trend is to lightweight bottles as much as possible. And then also to be able to tell the story in the vineyard or whatever other sustainability story the producer might have. We found with our Found range at M&S that customers want to hear the story of where the wine comes from, who the producer is, what they're doing in the vineyard, and I think we need to be able to tell those stories.
Yeah, and what about Will, who's obviously representing Nobel Wines, which specialise in a lot of emerging, if I may say, countries?
I have to echo almost exactly what George said. He's picked up on two of the biggest things, which is packaging and alcohol. Large bottles are almost seen as a thing of the past in a lot of people I speak to, and a lot of trends, a lot of markets I work in, and it's almost a bit cringy to see a big heavy 1.5 kilo bottle smashed down on a table these days. So it does make a difference, it just does. And the duty scheme in the UK as well is going to affect high alcohol wines even more so next year probably, and it's something that anyone buying wines into the UK is very sensitive of these days. I think packaging in general is something just to look at as well, because not always something which is stylistically appropriate for one market translates to another market as well. Certain images, icons, whatever, can be seen as old-fashioned rather than modern, and it's definitely something which we take into account. But one of the most important things is the storytelling of sustainability as well. We say, as lots of people do, wine selling is storytelling, so you need to be able to communicate not just the message of the wine, but the winery, the winemaker, the sustainability issue, and it's not a box-ticking exercise to say we have done X, Y, and Z. It has to be an honest message. Everyone's story is different. Don't try and put it all in the same box. Get that honest message out there.
And what about you, Susie, as a journalist?
Probably all of this in many ways. I haven't seen a screw cap since I've been here, which I think is quite unusual. It certainly would be unusual in the UK market. We need lighter bottles. Nobody's interested in, I don't think, really interested in heavy bottles these days. And yes, we don't. I mean, it sounds terrible because they're making a lot of big, heavy alcoholic wines in big bottles. That does need to change, if it's going to appeal to a UK market. More white wines, lighter alcohols, quite a change, I think, if it's going to really appeal in the UK to have Chinese wines. And price points, I would imagine, as well, because I would imagine we're going to struggle to import these wines at a price that people feel comfortable with. And we want it to be comfortable because otherwise they're not going to try the wines.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as we learned, from the presentation when on our first day, that China is now the top 15 wine producing country. However, it's still remain very unknown to the West part of the world. So what feedback would you give to producers who would like to export their wines in the UK? Will?
I think the point that we haven't touched on enough and you've just raised is you have to be price sensitive to the market you're trying to get into and the position you want to put the wine at. I think if you're coming into a new market with just a premium selection of wines, it's going to be difficult. You need to have different ranges covered. You need to make sure you can represent value at those price points as well. It doesn't matter if you don't have entry level wines, as long as you have a value representative price point going in there. It's one of the most important things.
What do you think?
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with Will about the price. I think the UK is number one and number two export market for many countries, and there's a lot of competition, and the wines need to stack up quality and price compared with wines from other countries. I do think that maybe starting with something like Cabernet Sauvignon as a familiar varietal in the UK is a good starting point. And then, as the market develops, then looking at kind of other varieties like Marcelin and other kind of point of difference. And then another point that Will touched on is the packaging. And the packaging needs to be clearly understandable for a wine consumer in the UK. It should be authentic. It should, be recognizably from China, but it needs to communicate what quality level it is, what kind of style is expected. So, and that's not an easy feat.
What about you looking at the on-trade?
I think for some of these wines, there would be a place in on-trade, especially if you consider number of restaurants serving food from China. And they would definitely be a good place to start, and you would create a demand within that. To do the crossover to sort of Italian, French or modern European restaurants, that's where the real challenge starts, because that's where you are then starting to compete with wines from all over the world. And quite frankly, with these heavy bottles, I see zero chance of it happening. It's like if someone comes and gives you this heavy bottle, A, my customer would scold me for having it on the list. B, it's like I would be less willing to personally. But then I know that many wine shops, distributors, and consumers, most importantly, are not interested in that anymore. So the packaging, and there comes a problem, because I feel there's a bit of a incongruency between the local market and the international market, and I think local market likes that and wants that. So what do you do?
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a, I think it's a decision for the producers to make what market they want to play at. Is there much actually incentive for them to be in markets like UK or Germany or places like that when they have got a massive market here, and it's probably easier sell here than it is over there, both price-wise and packaging-wise.
That's a good point, and something we touched based on just
earlier. Yeah. No, I mean, I think the Chinese have to decide, do you really want to be in the, we all know that the production and consumption in China has fallen dramatically in the last decade or so. So, yes, if consumption has fallen and you are going to up your production, you are going to have to export. But then that means you've got to really think about your export markets and change your strategy of what you're making and how you're packaging it. Do you want to do it? If you want to do it, you need to go for it full throttle. And if you don't want to do it and you want to stick with the domestic market and keep a smaller production base, that would be fine too, because it's going to be a challenge getting into any of these other markets. Like Issa said, you've got to really change your offering. Not in terms of necessarily always the flavour of the wine, but just everything that goes with it.
No, totally, yeah. So first time in China, and obviously we've only been here for a few days, but what's your first impression of the region? In few words, Will.
Definitely has potential. Very, very interesting. Somewhere I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on in the future to see how things develop.
Cool. Todd?
I have been taken aback by how welcoming and enthusiastic our hosts have been, and also I've learned a lot about the region, and I think it's really adaptable. The climate is not easy. It's continental. The winters are very cold. We learned that they have to bury the vines in the winter, which is very unique. So they're very adaptable, which I really appreciate.
I think potential for me is the one keyword here, and also the will and the sort of determination of the people will decide where it ends up. And you see that in the vineyard work, like you mentioned, Dror, about how hard is that vineyard to work in, to bury the wine, dig them up again and things like that. And so it'll be interesting to see what will happen in the next sort of decade or so in terms of viticultural development and varietal development, etc.
I feel slightly unqualified to answer because I feel like I arrived in Beijing flew 4 hours to get. It's such a huge country. I mean, I think it's about 17
Yeah.
times the size of France, and I think I've scratched the surface. I can't really comment. It's great, you know. We've had a lovely time, but I feel like I want to know more. I want to see more.
First impression.
Yeah.
First impression.
Well, first impression was, yeah, exactly as Isa said, you know, very enthusiastic people, and they want to make wine and they want to communicate about their wine. They want everybody to know about it, and they're hugely enthusiastic, which is lovely. So now we feel enthusiastic and we want to see the rest of it.
Exactly. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.